Okay, so yeah, hopefully this is a little bit of a whistle-stop tour of basics around the menstrual cycle and different considerations for hormonal contraceptive users. So what I wanted to start with was a short kind of sketch, it's a really bad drawing actually, but of some of the hormonal fluctuations that might occur across the adulthood of a female. When I'm talking about females today, I'm talking about those who are born female and identify as female. I'm not going to be talking about transgender women or women with differences in sexual development, although that's a whole different topic that needs some research. But what I'm trying to show here is that your hormonal levels during childhood are relatively low. During adulthood, there's a huge transition, but even within that, so I've kind of put that as straight lines at the top, there is variability. So you'll see cyclical variations in hormones such as estrogen and progesterone across the menstrual cycle. You might see chronically low estrogen and progesterone levels, for example, with contraceptive use, and you might see supraphysiological levels of these hormones, for example, during pregnancy. So even this doesn't really capture what would go on in an adult female. Then what we see in the postmenopausal stage is a rapid decline in these sex hormones, which plateaus out towards later in adulthood. So you can see here that obviously throughout the life of a female, you're going to see variability in terms of their steroid hormone profile. This is influenced by biological age, but also by other factors which might be lifestyle choices such as contraceptive use or pregnancy, or other factors such as medical conditions. I think the first thing I wanted to highlight is that this ultimately depends on what your research question is as to whether you need to consider this in this level of detail. So if your research question has a sex hormone-driven hypothesis, then this becomes really important to look at, and this is why I'm going to go through it in a second. There is obviously a big trade-off between the validity or ecological validity of testing females in their free living state and also testing them around very specific phases of their menstrual cycle or contraceptive use. And that's something that's going to be layered on in January with Emma O'Donnell's session around what factors should we consider around when should we control for these things, when should we not control, and how much should we control. But just to kind of break this down a little bit then, what I wanted to show was the heterogeneity that you might see within females, and when we're thinking about recruiting them, what they might look like. So if you take the top kind of tab here, I've got, does a female use contraception or not? If we follow the tab for yes, we've then got two further considerations. Is that hormonal contraception, i.e. is it delivering synthetic hormones, which are typically ethinyl estradiol and a synthetic form of progesterone or progestin, or is it a non-hormonal form of contraceptive? The only one that we're using today is the IUD device, or a copper coil, which I'll speak about later on, but this is a non-hormonal form of contraception. And in these women, they would typically still have a natural menstrual cycle and they would still ovulate. There are then a plethora of hormonal forms of contraception. We have our combined forms, which is a synthetic estrogen and progesterone, and these are shown here in green. So we've got a combined oral contraceptive pill, we've got a vaginal ring, and we've got patches. And then we have some progesterone-only preparations. So we have pills, we have the progesterone-only implant, injections, and there is a progesterone-only intrauterine device, or IUD, as well. If our participants are not contraceptive users, then the answer no to this direction. The next question is then, do they have a regular menstrual cycle? So if they're not a hormonal contraceptive user, we assume they have a regular menstrual cycle. But what does that actually look like in practice? So we consider a healthy regular menstrual cycle to be one that is 21 to 35 days in duration, but that may or may not be the case for all of our women. If the answer to this is yes, we have a question of, well, do they ovulate or not, and can we detect that ovulation? Whether we can or cannot detect this then affects the next cascade, so you can see that it gets quite complicated in terms of the different criteria. One of the things we might look at is, do their progesterone levels reach this target threshold, which I'll speak about a little bit more lately? Or do they have an anovulatory cycle, i.e. do they either not ovulate or do we not detect ovulation? And that will affect whether we then classify them as eumenorrheic or naturally menstruating. And I'm going to go through this in a few slides' time, so don't worry if you've lost me with the terminology. All I'm trying to highlight here is that there is significant heterogeneity within our young female population, and this needs consideration depending on your research question. So this, I'm sure, is something that you're all quite familiar with in terms of the hormonal fluctuations that you see across the menstrual cycle. So this is just kind of a quick overview of what happens. So the blue line on here is estrogen, the purple line is progesterone, and the orange is your luteinizing hormone. So what we say at the beginning of the menstrual cycle, or day 1, is considered to be day 1 of bleeding, the start of the participant's period, or start of menses. Typically this period is around 5 to 7 days in total, and typical menstrual blood loss for someone healthy would be, that should say 30 to 50 millilitres. Anything above 80 would be considered to be a heavy menstrual bleed. What happens during this follicular phase, or this first phase, is you get a significant rise in estrogen, and progesterone levels remain relatively low. Then what marks the centre, or the midpoint of the cycle, is ovulation. So that marks the boundary between the follicular phase and the luteal phase. And this is preceded by a rise in something called luteinizing hormone. And luteinizing hormone we can detect using urine ovulation detection kits. So these are sticks that some of you might have used for your research participants, some of you might be aware of them. The school actually now provide them, which is excellent, so we can accurately verify whether someone has had a surge in luteinizing hormone, which will precede ovulation. Once ovulation has occurred, we moved into the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle. Here we have a large rise in progesterone, and we have a secondary rise in estrogen, before this then falls down again to start the next cycle with the uterus lining shedding if there hasn't been fertilisation of an egg. I'm going to move on to contraceptive users in a second, so forgive me for going back and forward a little bit, but I just wanted to show what this might actually look like in a contraceptive user to highlight the difference that you might see. So you've got the menstrual cycle there in the bold lines. What we've then got down at the bottom here is the influence of using a combined monophasic oral contraceptive pill. And this would be that you get chronic downregulation of the endogenous levels of estrogen and progesterone. So the profile, or the hormonal profile, of these type of women is more akin with a postmenopausal woman. So if we're looking at something that has a sex-driven hypothesis, and we're looking at whether we want to look at how much estrogen changes or progesterone, you can see that actually these women are pretty different in terms of what their profile looks like. Then I thought it would be useful to kind of go back a step and talk about the terminology that's used. I think this field can be a little bit of a minefield in terms of all the different words that are used, and it makes it seem quite intimidating. It's not really, it's just knowing what these words mean. So some of the commonly used terms that you'll come across when kind of reading in this space is the definition of a naturally menstruating woman and how that might differentiate from someone who is eumenorrheic. So we define someone as naturally menstruating if they experience menses or they have a period, if their menstrual cycle length is considered to be healthy, i.e. between 21 to 35 days, but this is without confirmed ovulation. This doesn't necessarily mean that they don't ovulate, it could just mean that it's not been verified or not been tested. I wanted to highlight here that you might say that someone's cycle is the classic 28 days in length, and some people will have exactly the same length for every single cycle, and that makes it really easy for experimental testing. What happens in practice is, in reality, that can vary by up to plus or minus 8 days per month. So when you're thinking about scheduling someone, you have to kind of consider that when you're thinking about your testing schedule. It can also be heavily influenced by other outside factors. So if any of you have tried to test a female during the exam periods, you can see that their menstrual cycle might be completely different to what it is normally, the influence of stress, for example. And we also saw this during COVID. This can have a huge influence on people's natural menstrual cycle. So just take these numbers as a rough guide, and it might vary depending on circumstances. Eumenorrhea is considered to be our kind of gold standard, if you like, of what a woman could look like if they're in a perfect, healthy state. You'll see why I say that with kind of iterations in a second. But these women, again, experience menses. They have a cycle length of 21 to 35 days. And this time we have evidence of a luteinizing hormone surge, which gives us a proxy of ovulation. They would have correct hormonal profiling, and by that we mean we would expect to see low levels of estrogen and progesterone in the early follicular phase. In the late follicular phase, we'd see high estrogen and low progesterone. And the mid-luteal phase, we'd see that high progesterone with that secondary rise in estrogen. And that they haven't used hormonal contraceptives in the prior 3 months. So that's the kind of reference number that everyone is trying to get towards, is kind of testing these eumenorrheic women. But what I'll talk about in a second is that menstrual irregularities are pretty common in women, particularly in exercising women and women who may have energy deficiency. So it may not be possible to attain eumenorrhea in the women that we're testing in our studies, particularly in physiology and nutrition when looking at performance. So one of the menstrual irregularities that you may come across is something called luteal phase deficiency, or LPD. And this is in menstrual cycles where we see that rise in progesterone that we see in the luteal phase is less than 16 nanomolar in concentration. This is important because this is a marker of the ability for someone to sustain the endometrium lining and sustain a healthy pregnancy. So it's a marker of kind of menstrual health. what you'll see quite commonly is that these values will be less than this. And physically active women, it's proposed to be around 30%. In highly active women, it can be up to around 50%. So when you're thinking about putting together a study that's looking at, say, elite sports women, and you want to test things at a particular phase of the menstrual cycle, just take into consideration that actually there could be up to 50% of your population that won't be classified as eumenorrheic. So either you need to account for that and go, well, that is the population that I presented, and accept that it is as it is, or you have to over-recruit quite substantially to then target these eumenorrheic women. You then have anovulation, or women who do not have a menstrual cycle but do not ovulate, and again, this is relatively common in our athletic women. Another menstrual irregularity that you may see is oligomenorrhea, and that's when people have a longer than average cycle length, so something longer than 35 days. And then you have some more severe menstrual disturbances down at the bottom here. You have amenorrhea, so you have two types of amenorrhea. You have secondary and primary. The one that you're more likely to become familiar with perhaps is secondary amenorrhea, and this is when you have an absence of 3 or more consecutive periods. So you have no menses for 3 months-ish. And this is not used to describe pregnant women. This is something that's isolated. And if anyone's reading around the REDS literature, this is a sort of amenorrhea that we're referring to. The other amenorrhea is primary amenorrhea, and this is a failure to reach menarche or start your period by the age of 15, when the development of other secondary sexual characteristics are evident. This is a slightly cheesy slide, but it's just to maybe caution people from using these kind of generalisations that people put to the menstrual cycle. So whether that's people are super grouchy after ovulation, whether that's people are really emotional in the premenstrual phase, whether that's people are particularly hungry at phase of the menstrual cycle. Some of these things are founded on anecdotes, so there's no kind of experimental data behind them. Some of these kind of assertions, so this only do strength training in the follicular phase, has good kind of backing in terms of why that might be the case, in terms of testosterone levels are a little bit higher, estrogen's building, but actually experimentally they don't have an awful lot of robust evidence. And sometimes they do have good, robust experimental evidence, but I would just say be cautious with using things like this. I can't remember what I actually typed into Google to get this to come up, but it's quite a good idea of what people kind of sometimes say is happening to all women, but actually we see quite a lot of individual variability. And when we talk about individual variability in this space, I think this is somewhere there is genuine individual variability when it comes to the menstrual cycle, how people perceive it, and the symptoms they may or may not experience. So we talk about variability, and I spoke about it with some of my beetroot work previously. You may see that generally you see a finding, but there are a few people that are a little bit different. This is something that really is quite individual, so we need to be careful with tailoring recommendations to the individual, not kind of generalising. That hopefully is a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the menstrual cycle. Hopefully that's given people a little bit of an insight into something they may not have known previously. So the next step is the contraceptive users. So I thought I'd start, rather than go into what the contraceptive users are, what the different profiles are, but the why would be first. I think it's probably pretty obvious in terms of one of the key reasons that people will use hormonal contraceptives, and that is, of course, to prevent pregnancy. But this fundamentally isn't the only reason people will choose to use contraceptives. They are highly used amongst our sports personnel and general population, and this isn't the only cited reason for doing so. One of the big reasons for doing it, and particularly for the people that you will be recruiting for your studies, it could be related to menstrual cramps that they've experienced during their menstrual cycle. People commonly report quite severe symptoms around their menstrual cycle and discomfort, particularly around the phase of menses, and the contraceptive pills are a really good way to alleviate that pain. And the reason why that works is if someone has quite severe menstrual pain, that can link with the uterine contractions during menses. If they're quite severe, you've usually got high levels of prostaglandins. So what contraceptives actually do is they lower the prostaglandin release, which means that it's less severe in terms of the pain. And so that's one of the ways in which they can work to reduce the severity of menstrual cramps. So this can be useful for all kinds of people, but it can also include people who are suffering with gynecological conditions such as endometriosis. It can be used to help with the treatment of premenstrual syndromes. So these might be experienced in the, say, week up to someone going into their period. They may experience severe or extreme physical or emotional symptoms due to the stark changes in hormones that they experience. So moving from very high levels of estrogen and progesterone, crashing down to very, very low levels. This can cause symptoms in women which can range from all sorts of things, but mood swings, breast tenderness, food cravings, irritability, bloating, and in some women, none of those symptoms at all. But the contraceptive pill and other forms of contraception can help alleviate this. Another big reason for doing this is shorter, lighter bleeds on an expected or a predictable schedule. So what you'll see in someone that uses the combined monophasic oral contraceptive pill in the way that it was originally utilised, which was a 3-day pill at 3 weeks of taking the pill and a 1-week withdrawal bleed. The idea behind that was that it allowed you to regulate exactly when you would have a withdrawal bleed. So people could accurately time that around, well, I want to be on a competition week that week, so I really want to make sure I'm not on a heavy bleed. They can kind of manipulate those pill packets to make sure that time's how they want it to. So that's a big reason why women, and particularly active women, will do this. Your choice of hormonal contraception is really individual, but family history can play a part in this, and actually some of the contraceptive methods can lower risk of certain types of cancers and cysts. They can be used for acne management, so absolutely nothing to do with the traditional idea behind contraception, but they can help manage acne. And they can also be used to reduce androgen production in people with polycystic ovarian syndrome. So there's a whole plethora of reasons why people might use contraception, and it isn't just to prevent pregnancy. So what's being used at the moment? Well, the most common form of hormonal contraceptive that's used at the moment is the combined monophasic oral contraceptive pill, and I'll explain what this is in a moment. Second to that, or increasingly, is the intrauterine devices, seen down at the bottom here. We are seeing an increase in IUDs. Now, as a consequence of that, the predominant focus of research to date has been done using the combined oral contraceptive pill, and much less has been done using other forms of contraception. So it makes sense, right? And I've done it myself. You recruit your menstrual cycle participants, and then you look at what then is the second most common hormonal profile, and that will be the woman that uses combined monophasic oral contraceptive pills. So all of your research is done in that space. But that means we know much less about, say, for example, the oral patch, the implant, the injection, and other kind of classifications. So I guess that's a call from this paper directly, but also the research more generally, to give better representation to the other forms of contraception and what that might look like. How do they work then, and what do they look like? So I think I mentioned on a few slides back, and I showed you that profile or that cascade of the different forms. This is what they look like. So we have contraceptive pills. We have combined pills, which give synthetic estrogen and progesterone, and we do have progesterone-only pills. With the combined pills, these were traditionally taken as 21 days of synthetic hormone and then a 1-week pill withdrawal. The progesterone-only pills are taken back to back, so you'll have 21 pills in a packet, and you'll just take them back to back to back continuously without having a withdrawal. You then have an implant, which is placed on the upper arm, it's underneath the skin, and this is a progesterone-only preparation. This can be in there for up to 3 years, but obviously a woman can have that removed earlier if she wishes to. You have the injections, which are done every 10 to 12 weeks. There are 2 forms of injection now. There's a self-administered and there's a medical-administered one. These are progesterone-only. You have the patches. These are combined preparations. These can be on for 7 days, and you use these three different patches, so change every 7 days. You have the vaginal ring, which again is a 21-day insertion, and you've got your progesterone-only IUDs. Now, if you just ignore the IUDs for a second, these all work in a very similar way. And in order to kind of prevent pregnancy, which is the main kind of cause or reason behind the contraception in the first place, was they do these 3 things. They cause thickening of the cervical mucus, thinning of the endometrial lining, and they suppress ovulation. And together, all of these things prevent pregnancy. The IUD is slightly different, and that's because it has a more localized response to the exogenous progesterone. So in these women, you may see a regular menstrual cycle, and you may still see ovulation. Because they're not suppressing that ovulation, they have more localized effects as opposed to the systemic effects that you might see, for example, from ingesting the pills. Just going to speak about the pill for a second because there's a few different ones, and I think this is the one that most of you will come across most often. So there are a few different types. So within our combined preparations, we have different types even within that. So this is why it gets quite complicated. So we have monophasic, and this is why you have 21 pills that deliver the same amount, i.e. mono, of hormone in each pill. So every pill is identical in terms of the amount of estrogen and the amount of progesterone that it delivers. This form of estrogen is typically ethinyl estradiol, but the form of synthetic progesterone can vary from pill to pill. Now in the literature what you'll see is that there's a call to try and use a homogeneous form of contraception throughout. So you'll see that they want you to use a specific type of pill, so that might be the combined pill, specific preparation, which might be monophasic, and even within that, because there's variability in the progesterone type and a progesterone concentration, there's a course to narrow it down to even isolate that. If you try and do that in practice, which is what I tried to do without better knowledge at the beginning of my PhD, you get really unstuck because you find it really, really difficult to find people who've got exactly the same progesterone and exactly the same concentrations. So just be mindful that even this, there's still variability within in terms of the type of progesterone and the actual concentration. This was just a little bit of information, but women may back-to-back their pill packets before having withdrawal bleed. So just because you have somebody who's a combined user, it doesn't mean that they'll take 3 weeks of pills and then definitely have a week off. They might choose to back-to-back those. And that's something that historically people have been like, oh no, that's dangerous to do, you shouldn't do that. But this review that was done in 2009 considered it was perfectly safe to take a break between pill packets. To not take a break between pill packets. There's no physiological or medical reasoning for not doing so. So you'll find now that increasingly women will say, oh, I'm not going to have a break in my pills until January. That's fine, that's kind of what they're expected though, that's what a lot of women will now do. And that just helps with them managing the withdrawal bleed around, say, their training, competition, or other lifestyle factors. So just be aware that that happens a little bit as well. People don't necessarily have the break. These are less common, but you also have biphasic and triphasic preparations as well. So biphasic will be that there are sections with different concentrations of the hormones. There'd be 2 different phases, so a follicular and a luteal phase. Triphasic would be that each week there's a different types of the hormones. These are less common, but they're still combined preparations that you might experience. And then I've spoken about this already, but yeah, progesterone only, you have, 28 days of pills without pill breaks, so you just go continuously with those. IUDs I've spoken about very briefly, but these can be in place for up to 5 to 10 years. They exert more localized effects, but just to be mindful that we have 2 types of IUDs. So if someone says to you they are an IUD user, you need to ask the question about whether they are using a progesterone-based IUD or whether it's copper-based. So what the copper preparation does is it prevents pregnancy by releasing copper into the uterus. This doesn't have the same effects as the progesterone only because it's not a hormone. And then just before I finish up, there's a few kind of things that I think I've been asked before, I thought could be questions that people are now asking. So can you group all the combined preparations together? So I've spoken about there's a few different things that are considered to be combined. So that might be the pills, might be the patches. Can you just put them together and go, well, we're going to look at people that use combined preparations? The thing that I would say to consider there is that there are distinct differences in the concentrations of the hormones that are delivered with these different preparations. So the type of estrogen might be the same, but the type of progesterone might be different and the concentrations might be different. So you just need to consider that. Can we use the terminology that we use for the menstrual cycle for contraceptive users? Can we say they have an early follicular phase and a mid-luteal phase? I would say, and I think it's recommended within the literature now, not to impose menstrual cycle language on contraceptive users. So don't try and say that someone on the pill is in their early follicular phase because that's not where they are. Try and use language such as active pill phase or synthetic hormone consumption phase or days or inactive, i.e. pill withdrawal. So try not to use the language interchangeably. Do pill users have a menstrual cycle? No. So pill users, their withdrawal bleed is not a marker of menstrual cycle health. This is a withdrawal bleed from the synthetic hormones. It's not the same as having a menstrual cycle bleed. And therefore you can't say that somebody's got a healthy menstrual cycle because they're on the pill and they've had a withdrawal bleed. They are not the same thing. You cannot use that as a criteria. When should I test a pill user? I would just say be mindful that endogenous concentrations of these hormones rise during the pill-free interval. So your endogenous levels of natural estrogen and progesterone begin to rise towards the end of a pill-free interval, for example. Also, your endogenous concentrations of those synthetic hormones rise during the pill-taking phase. So once you've been taking that pill for 14, 15 days, your endogenous levels of those synthetic hormones are going to be a little bit higher than they are at days 1 to 2 of taking those pills. Hopefully this is now a little bit clearer. This is just the slide I presented at the beginning, but hopefully what I'm now showing you is that there's hormonal preparations of contraception, some of which are combined, some of which are progesterone only. There's also non-hormonal versions of contraception. Obviously, we've got condoms that I don't need to mention on here for reasons of female physiology, but the copper coil is one that is of relevance. Then when we're thinking about the menstrual cycle, there's a few different things to consider. You've got menstrual irregularities, so you've got longer than normal menstrual cycles, shorter than normal. You've got amenorrhea, you've got anovulation, and you've got luteal phase deficiency. These are kind of typical menstrual cycle irregularities that you may experience, but you've also got women that will be classified as eumenoric or naturally menstruating, depending on how you classified them. So it looks like it's a bit of a minefield, but actually when you delve down into it, using these sorts of pathways, you can simplify quite nicely what someone might look like. That was it. Hopefully that was about 20 minutes. I don't know, maybe it was a bit longer. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Emily and Tom, for the invite to talk to you today. As mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit more about inclusive practices and some tips and strategies. So we're kind of zooming out from where Sam has been, looking very specifically at the menstrual cycle. Why am I up here talking to you about this? Well, I am female and also a prior athlete, and from a young child, someone who's been involved in sport and all kinds of different sport and activities throughout my life, which I thought as an innocent child was very normal for a girl or a young girl or teenager to be doing. But it wasn't really until I got to university where all of a sudden people told me that I was too difficult, that females were too complicated, that we don't conduct research on females in sport and exercise science. And I very much learnt SES through the male lens. Unfortunately, some people still teach SES through the male lens, but I guess enough said about that. But we all know that we are 50% of the population. Despite that, you've probably heard, read about, seen the statistic that approximately 6% of SES research is conducted exclusively on female participants. And when I saw this, I wasn't particularly shocked, and obviously thought, well, that's not good enough. And as a female researcher, somebody who has tried throughout my career so far to include females in research, some of that research is on the slide for you to see, I thought, well, I must be doing a much better job because, nobody likes to be told that they're not doing a very good job. And I thought, well, if I'm going to stand up here and talk to people about including females in research, then I better have a look at my research and my publications and see actually how well am I doing. Better than 6%, but I'll hold my hand up and say still not good enough, and that's something that I want to change. Throughout the rest of my career, I've got 51% of male-only publications. That's all original research, so obviously no review papers, etc. included in that. 14% are female only, and then 37% of my published work has included both males and females. And we can look at all different areas within sort of SES, physiology, nutrition, and other disciplines. The graph that you'll see on the screen at the moment is from soccer research that looked at male versus female publications. And they came away and found that about 20% of soccer-related research has been published exclusively on women, given that soccer is arguably the most popular sport for women globally. And we can see there that we have seen a very sharp increase in the last kind of 15 to 20 years, and hopefully that will continue to rise. But something that I'm going to talk about a lot today, and something that I'm also very passionate about, is one, not just doing more research on women, because people bang that drum and say, let's just do more research on women. Well, yes and no, because we need the quality of that research to be good. It's not just about more, it's about higher quality research, and it still comes down to that question of, the so what. The scientists, we don't just want to go out there conducting studies for the sake of conducting studies. It's obviously not ethical to do that. We really want to be actually answering questions that are going to help females within SES, or specifically physiology and nutrition. And when it comes to menstrual health, as a lot of the research has been around menstrual health and the menstrual cycle, 81% of that research does not consider the ethnicity of athletes. And when it does, it rarely meets the cultural safety criteria that it should do. So we've got some problems, we've got some issues that we need to solve within our female athlete research, and hopefully today I'm going to give you some tips and ideas and strategies to help solve those together. But one thing I'd really love to eradicate is this concept and this stereotype that we're complicated, that females are complicated, that it's too expensive, that it's too difficult, because language matters. And I've said that before, you know, I think because as a young undergraduate student I was told that, then I regurgitated that and said, oh yeah, you know, it's just a little bit too complicated. But let's draw the line in the sand there and say, no, let's just, you know, let's stop using that language. And, you know, I've only been at Loughborough since January, and when I was preparing for my interview, as you do, you look at the research and you look to see what's going on. And still, you know, we're about to hopefully launch the Women in Sport Hub. We have a special population section, of which females is top there. I've said it so many times. Yeah. If anyone knows how we can change that, then...
I'd like to be special as well.
Yeah.
Males be on that list.
Exactly. Given that we're 50% of the population, arguably we could also put male athletes on this list. So I hope that we see change in this space. But yeah, language matters. It's really important. So even if we're joking, even if we're being jovial, even if we say something to a student, you don't know what impact that has on them, their perceptions, and just reinforcing those kind of stereotypes. So yeah, quite like Helen Mirren, so let's just stop it. And you know, I'm all about solutions. We can bang on about the problems, the issues, the difficulties, but students, practitioners, researchers, we're scientists. We solve problems, we help people. You know, that's our job. So let's take action and let's get on with our job. Another thing that, you know, we like to do, and again, hold my hands up, as scientists, as researchers, as practitioners sometimes, is to sit on our nice island. I wish I was sat on a nice warm island today instead of in the snow. But yeah, we sit there in our nice little disciplines of, I'm a physiologist, or I'm a nutritionist, or I'm a sociologist, this is what I do. It's nice and it's comfortable, it's cosy. We don't want to leave that island because, you know, the sharks and other things. But really, we need to be working outside of our silos. I'm sure that there are many of you in this room that are already doing this, that are working as, you know, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary teams, that you are utilising models such as the Biopsychosocial model into your studies and your research design. You know, Sam spent 20 odd minutes talking about biology, but we can't simply just reduce females to their biology. And even when dealing with male participants, we know that the impact from a physiological, nutritional perspective that the environment has. We know what an impact somebody's mood, someone's psychology, their emotions. We know what of an impact the culture has on them. So we need to start looking at some of these sociological models. I'm not a sociologist, nor do we need to be sociologists, but we can include those experts within our research team and within our designs from the start. Another new kind of popular concept that I'm just learning about, and I know Professor Holly Thorpe delivered a talk here a little while ago, is new materialisms and how we can understand how bodies change through time and with different cultures. You know, I don't have the time today to go into these concepts, but there's a lot of literature out there and they're starting to come, particularly within the female athlete space. Katie Schofield in New Zealand, along with Holly Thorpe, they've got some interesting papers, and there's plenty of books for you to look at and read, to upskill yourself, but also, you know, talk to people. I had a chat with Emma Pullen a couple of weeks ago, and I said, this is what I'm thinking of doing. This is my understanding. Tell me if it's a load of rubbish. Can you please help me with this? Because, you know, she's got a much better understanding than I do. Some of you may have received an email yesterday. Maybe you just deleted it. I don't blame you. But if you did read it, then you might have found out that I'm the school integrity champion now for research. So it is part of my role, as well as just one of my passions, to promote these inclusive research cultures and practices. and that relates to equality, equity, diversity and inclusion. So for the next kind of 10 minutes or so, I'm going to talk to you about how we can create safe places, because us as researchers, as students and all of the stakeholders that we are going to involve within our research, we want to make sure that everybody feels safe. The first step to doing this, and I think one of the most important things that we can do, is to co-create, is to ensure that the participants that we're going to be working with have a seat at the table from conception all the way through to dissemination. There's been a couple of studies within the female space that have started to do this, that have started to look at the athlete voice, a couple of papers there, but even in the study with Team USA, within this paper they identified that they hadn't done the best job that they could do in terms of including some of the Paralympic athletes with this. It's clear that there's still fairly a narrow stereotype or a narrow proportion of females that are coming through voluntarily to participate in the research, and we've got a really large untapped population of females that we're not attracting to our studies for some reasons. Hopefully some of those I'll outline today. So how can we make our research more inclusive? How can we include people with different disabilities, with different capabilities? Again, I don't have the time today to go into depth on these strategies, but one of them is the universal design of research. I think when we sit there and we design our studies, we probably design for the average person. We probably design for somebody who's like us, because we assume that people are like us, and that's the lived experience that we have. I don't have dyslexia, but do I consider people who have dyslexia in my study design? No, not always, not to the best of my ability, not to the extent that I should. I'm not talking about completely overhauling your research design to make it more complicated for you, but are there ways that we can make small tweaks to our study from conception to dissemination to include those people who have neurocognitive or are neurodiverse or have different capabilities like dyslexia? It might not be that actually we're recruiting people specifically with dyslexia, but there's also females to think about who have multiple different jobs, who are really stressed, whose reading ability might just deteriorate because that they are so tired, and we're giving them these reams and reams of pre-participant information and informed consent in all this nice scientific language for them to read beforehand. Isn't that still the best way to do it? Just because Professor 50 years ago decided that that's how informed consents should be delivered, should we still be doing that in almost 2025? Can we have those as an audio file? That would help people who are visually impaired, who maybe struggle to read that tiny text that you've put on that background. Could we make things bigger? So, for example, if we're using something, I don't know, say you've got a pencil or you've got some kind of implement that you're using within your research, that might be good for somebody who's got good dexterity and fine motor skills and can hold a pen or a pencil as you can. You might not think about someone who can't, because that's not your lived experience, but could we provide them with a thicker pen, a thicker pencil? Can we make the text larger? Can we increase the size of images? If we've got somebody who has hearing difficulties, can we provide some kind of video for them of the informed consent of us speaking with subtitles? There's lots of different ways in which we can do this, and this paper here, and the Williams and Moore, has a really nice case study that you can kind of look at and work through, and they have the certain criteria. And one of the big things that they say is, if you don't have that knowledge, ask somebody. Consult with somebody else.
Turn and center face.
That's all right. Some of you may look at research from a clinical perspective, but even if you don't, as physiologists, as nutritionists, you might be getting people to come to the lab on several occasions. Think about how inclusive that is. Do you really need all of the inclusion and exclusion criteria that you currently have on that list? What's a non-negotiable? What could you maybe get rid of or change a little bit? A lot of females, as I'll go on to say, are carers. They have other responsibilities. You're asking them to come to the lab 5 or 6 times. Can you make that a little bit easier for them? Is there any way in which you can change the design of your study so that they're not having to coming as many times? Again, is there anything that you can do virtually with them? That first visit, does it have to be in person? Can we start to do some things online? Again, this paper has some really nice examples and suggestions. From a cultural safety perspective, again, this isn't just a tick box exercise. It's not just about including more people of different ethnicities and cultural backgrounds because the research told us to do so. We also have to be really considerate of other intersectional variables and factors within our research design, such as religion, socio-economic status, etc. And it's about rethinking the design so that people feel culturally safe and respected throughout the process. It's not just about adding more people. So again, including them, this co-creation from conception to dissemination. There's a few tips for you here on the right-hand side. On the left, you'll see the consolidated criteria, which is a 32-item checklist, utilised mainly within qualitative research, focus groups and interviews, which helps you to decide or at least capture some of that information. It's kind of like the question that came earlier to Sam about should we be asking this? Yes, let's ask as much as is feasible about the participant to help us with our EDI in terms of research. Some practical tips for you coming up from conception to dissemination. The first of those is think about the images, think about the text, think about your recruitment material. Is it reflecting the type of participant that you would like to attract to your study? If you're doing a study on Muslim women, for example, we're not going to plaster a white woman in a bikini on our recruitment material. Yeah, it's just not appropriate to do that. What about different languages? Including participants and including research members within the team who speak different languages, or including that as part of your budget for translators. If you don't have the skills, if you don't have people in your network that can translate for you, then perhaps include that within a grant. That is also there from an EDI perspective, so it's something that obviously you can rationalise and support. This was an example from Lee, Natalia, Salma was involved in this project and a few others from Loughborough University. All of the material online, again, was translated into different languages. Again, coming back to imagery, is it representative of the type of participants? If we're recruiting, we're doing a call out for females, let's have some diversity with those images. If you're struggling or you're not sure who to talk to, and even if you do have good connections within your research team, one good way to, again, strengthen the participation of females from different backgrounds is to work with community groups. They're already there. They're already doing this work. Many can be found on social media. Reach out to them. Ask them. Tell them about your research. Say, do they want to be involved? Have they got any ideas about how the research design could be improved? What barriers are they facing? What questions do they have? We sit here in the university or at home, we come up with the questions, but there might be a better way or a slightly different variation of that question that's actually really important to this community or this group. And you can also include these participants as ambassadors, as advocates for your research as well. Small little changes. Sam and Emily and I were just talking in the break there. You know, I didn't know until Sam said 5 minutes ago that we now have urine ovulation kits available to us, just like, you know, all of the other kind of general consumables within SES in the lab. That's fantastic. That makes a difference. Period products, you know, having those available in the toilet, being able to say on a informed consent or a participant information to a female who's worried coming into the lab or to this environment for the first time, in the toilet there's free sanitary products. There's a safe place for you to get changed. You know, as a female walking into a male-dominated environment, where am I going to get changed? Are the male research team going to be there? Is there somewhere private for me? What is the attire expected to be? If I've got a particular religious or cultural background, and you're telling me that I have to wear a sports bra, is that necessary for the study design? Or can I wear something that I feel more comfortable and is more appropriate for me? Even using privacy screens, again, these small things can help. Is there going to be a massive window there where people are walking by when I'm exercising, or is there opaque glass, or can we cover it? I mentioned most females, or a lot of females, are going to be carers. They could also be parents. How can we make it easier, again, for them to be involved in our research? Can we compensate them for their time? And then dissemination. Appealing to both male and female participants and athletes, and that diversity as well. It's amazing now, we have so many creatives that we can include. You know, there's a couple of studies from our group where we ensure that somebody in the team has the ability to create these really attractive infographics. And then thinking about the communities and the groups that we're going to be working with, how can we disseminate that in the best way? They're probably not going to read our research paper. Will they read an infographic? Would they like a video summary? Again, going back to that disability and inclusion, how can we make it accessible to everybody? So I don't want this to be a carrot and a stick. This isn't, you know, a court of law. It's not about telling people you're doing right or you're doing wrong. You know, we can all improve and we can all learn from each other. I'm standing up here. I have my own lived experience, but I see life through my own bias and my own lens, as do we all. Yeah, again, we can all learn from each other. I'm sure our ideas will change and evolve, as they should. And there's no stupid question. Yeah, sometimes when we're engaging in these processes, particularly around female health, we might not want to cause offence. We might not want to say something silly or stupid. Yeah, there isn't any stupid questions. We should all be open and encouraging and supportive of each other. Thank you.